Greetings and welcome to this episode of Happenings at 2715. My name is Kurt Gibson, and today our guest will be IHSA Assistant Executive Director Stacy Lambert. Stacy's been a frequent guest of the show in the past, and we appreciate her taking time today to discuss one of the biggest changes within the association this year, a new fall acclimatization policy. This is a significant change because beginning this year, most all other fall sports will now need to follow a very prescribed practice regimen. And Stacy will help us work through those details today. So Stacy, welcome back to Happenings.
Thank you for having me.
All right, there's a lot to cover with this new policy. So let's just begin with what the new policy requires teams to do or to follow in terms of their early practice schedule. So sort of just the what's at play now.
Basically, the new policy is setting up a practice plan stating that for days 1 through 5, you're allowed to have one practice for a maximum of 3 hours. Then you would have a 3-hour break, and then you were able to have a 1-hour walkthrough. Then starting on day 6, you can start 2-a-day practices as long as you're going every other day with those. And on the days that you're not doing a 2-a-day practice, you go back to the 1-a-day practice schedule.
So once you get through this early season phase, then you're sort of on an every other day, multiple practice kind of approach.
Correct, yes.
But a lot of people, I think, are you finding that people are starting school earlier, so it's not like they're losing out on all this practice time before school gets started?
Right. It does seem like a lot of schools are starting school as early as Wednesday the 14th, which was our traditional day when practice could begin. So with our move to start the practice season earlier on Monday the 12th, that is probably helping out some schools to be able to practice for those couple of days before classes begin.
Now, we're talking about fall sports. Are we talking about all fall sports?
We're talking about all fall sports with the exception of golf.
Okay. And golf, the rigors of, I'm a golfer, but I recognize that there's a different, there's not as much rigor to the conditioning as there are in other sports. So it's probably the thing that separates it from the rest of the fall sports.
Correct. The committee did look at golf, but decided just with the pace that golf is played at, they felt that it was okay for them to be outside of the acclimatization period that they established.
So now, except for golf, all fall sports are under this new policy. And I know football had been under an acclimatization policy prior. So does this change anything for football?
It does change a little bit for football. Days 1 through 5 especially, you're allowed to have one 3-hour practice. In the past, some schools did break that 3-hour practice down into like 2 1.5-hour practices or something along those lines. So we have established the 1 3-hour practice. Football also will now have a 3-hour break in between their practice sessions. In the past, they were allowed a 2-hour break. The national model or data would show us that the 3-hour break is what's safest for the students to get that time, in an air-conditioned environment where they can let their bodies fully rest and cool down and recover from that morning practice.
Sure, makes sense. Plus you give athletes more time to rehydrate and everything that you need to do just to stay in a good condition, for
Definitely.
your early season practices. Okay, so that's what the change is. Now take us a little bit behind the scenes. Why is this important? How is this going to benefit student athletes in Illinois?
This is something that our Sports Medicine Advisory Committee has been talking about for a few years. They've researched, nationally, there are some other states that have similar models. The most similar model to what we're going to be using is from Missouri. And they really felt that this helps all students to make sure that everyone, even the students who maybe were working at their part-time job all summer and didn't have as much time to participate in summer workouts and camps, that they can come in to the first day of practice and they can let their bodies get used to practice at the same level as the athletes who are participating all summer. It also is going to make sure that all of those students, they're getting used to their sport at the same rate and at the same pace, and hopefully that'll translate to a healthier overall season for these student athletes so that their bodies aren't breaking down so quickly over the course of their season.
We forget that sometimes. I think that, not every student athlete is approaching day one of the season at the same physical condition as the rest of their teammates. So you've got to give everybody time to build up appropriately. So you've got your athletes at the end of the season when it's maybe most important.
Exactly. And we're here at the IHSA, we're all about participation. We want our student athletes to all have the opportunity to wear their school logo on their chest and be a part of that team. So we want to make sure that everybody from day one, feels like they came out, they gave it their all, and they had appropriate time to rest and recover from their workout.
Now, you mentioned the model that we're following here is mirrored a little bit on what is happening in Missouri, a neighboring state. But nationally, are there other states that are using some kind of acclimatization?
There are other states, yes. Florida and Arizona specifically are two that jump to mind. There might be one or two more. So we're kind of on the forefront of this, which is pretty exciting for us in Illinois. But it's definitely something that you would hear that states should be doing. They should be establishing these kind of policies. That's the information we would get, from national governing bodies. That's what they would tell us.
Good. All right. So now, since this is new, I'm sure you've had a lot of questions rolling in. What are some common questions from coaches that, how is this going to work? Can I do this? Can I not do that?
Yeah. A couple questions that we get are about our multi-sport athletes and how we're going to work through them, making sure that they're at X number of practices for each sport. And we're kind of handling those a little bit on an individual basis. So if you have a question about your multi-sport athlete, please call the office and talk to somebody here, talk to myself, talk to that sport administrator so that we can work through those questions. Because we do want to work with those kids. We want to encourage them to play more than one sport, for sure. The other thing that we've been getting is just some confusion on how this works with what our traditional practice plan was. Maybe we used to have practice and then a team dinner, and how do we do that? So schools have been really good about emailing, asking those questions, explaining what they've done in the past, and then we've been talking through a way of how we can work that into the new policy.
Right, yeah. So, it's interesting because there's probably some who would say this kind of policy overreaches a little bit in some fashion and maybe doesn't give the high school coach enough credit to know what's appropriate for his or her players in early season practices. So what would be your response to those folks who would claim that, hey, the high school coach knows best, and if they think they need to practice for 4 hours, they should just be able to do it, and we shouldn't worry about that?
Yeah. I understand where those folks are coming from because they're the ones who are seeing their kids day in and day out, where here sitting in the office in Bloomington, we're a little farther removed. But our sports medicine advisory committee is made up of athletic trainers, team physicians, and school personnel from across the state. So they do see what's going on day in and day out, and they really felt that we needed to take some additional steps to ensure the safety for all of our students. Heat illness, that's something that's preventable. So for our outdoor sports, it's a way to try to stop one of those injuries before they occur. And even for our indoor sports, maybe they're participating in an air-conditioned facility, just getting those kids the opportunity to build back up to their mid-season competitiveness. Even if they've been playing all summer, it's still good for their bodies to kind of slowly work back up to that peak performance that they're going to want to find during their high school season.
The other thing that I think also plays into it a little bit, there was probably a time, a generation or so ago, when the folks who were doing all the high school coaching were instructors, they were teachers at the high school, and they had been trained in college to be coaches. I know there are a lot of people now getting into the coaching ranks at the high school level who don't have that perspective and don't have that background. So they're well-meaning people. They probably know a lot about sports, but they may not know a lot about the science of conditioning and how to properly prepare oneself for peak performance. So I think this just helps ensure that it creates the safest environment for the students that we can possibly have.
Yeah, I think that's what we're really trying to do, is just make sure that all of those student athletes, from your top performers to your ones who are just there for fun and participation, are protected as best as we can to make sure that they all have an enjoyable experience.
And it's hard because, a lot of times folks get involved or coach the way they were coached and what worked for them. And, we have to keep in mind that we know so much more today than we did 20, 30 years ago. And so we need to use that information to our advantage.
Yeah, for sure. I can think back to when we would do 3-a-day practices, and there were girls on day 2 and 3 that couldn't tie their own shoes because they were so sore. And really, what did that help? It didn't help them participate later on in the season. It just made their first week of practice miserable. And That's not making them a better volleyball player or a better soccer player or
better anything.
And a better anything,
Yeah.
exactly.
So it seems like, as we wrap this up, last one, I'll get you out of here on this. It seems like over the last few years, the association's done some work with heat-related matters. I know there was a little change a few years ago with a heat policy of when contests can be played. Now we've got the new fall acclimatization, which tries to accommodate or recognize that it's hot at the beginning of the fall season. How about on the other side of the coin? What about cold weather? Is there any talk amongst SMAC about looking at policies concerning cold weather? Now that wouldn't necessarily apply in the fall, but it could in the winter or the spring.
We do have the cold weather policy on our agenda for the 2019-20 school year. We had a interesting conference call late last spring where we learned that Maine and Montana do have cold weather policies.
Oh.
So that's something that we're going to look into a little bit further to see what they're doing in those states. Granted, Maine and Montana, very different climates than here in Illinois, but it's something worth looking into that sports medicine does feel that's important. So, more to come on that front.
Okay. I know we get a lot of calls in the spring when those first baseball and softball games are getting played, or track or lacrosse, and it's right around freezing, and people want to know, can we play? Can we, can't we? And it's like, well, at this point, it's really your call to make.
Yeah, right now it still is. We want our schools to definitely play it safe. Very
good. Well, thanks for taking us through the details of this new policy today, Stacy. Clearly, this is a significant change and an important one for all IHSA member schools, and it's clear that the Sports Medicine Advisory Committee remains focused on player safety. So on behalf of our entire production crew here at Happenings at 2715, we appreciate you taking the time today to join us for this broadcast. Thanks for your continued support, and remember, support your local high school by attending one of its events.